Today's episode filmed in front of a live studio audience.
It's mighty strange. You looking happily deranged. I can you settle in bed? Or have you picked your target yet? Listen, dear. Don't your dog bite? Listen, dear.
This is the next episode of Direct to Netflix. I'm Connor.
I'm Colin.
I'm Al, I guess.
And this week we looked at Cooties, starring Elijah Wood, Allison Pill, that guy from the Office.
And Kevin Bacon.
So, the best way that I can sum up Cooties is it's a 28 Days Later set in an elementary school with Elijah Wood.
And also just a really not very good comedy in general. It's actually, no, because since a couple of us, we actually watched it at least a couple times at this point. I kind of noticed that this time, like, the comedic parts were a little bit funnier, but the bad parts were infinitely worse.
The synopsis of the movie is that it's set in an elementary school where the kids start turning into zombies after one of them eats an infected chicken nugget. The virus spreads throughout the school, the kids start attacking and killing the teachers, and only a few of them are left. Elijah Wood plays a substitute teacher taking over for the day in a first-grade class who is writing a book about a man who wants to have sex with an evil boat. Or at least that's what the movie tells us. He comes back to his town to live with his mom to write his book, and possibly meet up with an old childhood sweetheart, maybe?
Actually, that's one thing I should probably, that kind of rubbed me the wrong way, is that they kind of try to dismiss in the movie, where, like, the instant you see that girl, you know that it's going to be the love interest of the movie, but the whole thing when he's like, oh, hey, I knew that you worked here, I just wanted to say hi, that just seemed really creepy to me. And also, I think we should probably bring up that he's also, like, just this terrible writer. Like, it kind of addresses from the beginning, he's kind of a hack fraud of sorts.
Hack fraud? That's a terrible way to talk about the writers.
Oh yeah, let's talk about the writing of this movie. Because for me, right off the bat, like, when me and Connor watched it for the first time, we kind of noticed that it was relatively competently directed. Actors did alright with what they did, but the writing is pretty wretched.
I like to refer to this as the Dan Schneider rule of script writing, where in all of his TV shows, iCarly, Drake and Josh, that kind of stuff, the characters, the children all talk like adults, and the adults all talk like children.
In all fairness, though, one thing that Cooties has that the Dan Schneider productions is the far less foot fetish, so we can put that in Cooties' favor at least.
Yeah, Dan Schneider had nothing to do with this, so there is a noticeable absence of teenage feet being rubbed, toes being sucked, being oiled and massaged. So that's a plus. So the movie starts out with the adults being stupid, and not just stupid, but inattentive to the fact that these kids are slowly infecting each other and mauling teachers in the school playground. But before this, we get to see how stupid all the adults are. The stereotypical jock is playing basketball in the yard and not noticing the fact that people are being murdered all around him. The teachers are in their classroom teaching about the dumbest things, like how you can't teach creationism, or their parents being divorced, and eventually it all starts out with not really the patient zero zombie, because the little girl that gets infected by eating an infected chicken nugget infects another kid, and he becomes the leader zombie that existed kind of in 28 Days Later.
Although, actually, it didn't really make any sense because, like, they never really show that he's, like, really smart or even, like, really all that competent. Like, if they had, like, a smart kid who turned into a zombie and was a leader, that could make sense. But, yeah, just having this kid, like, being the one who, like, takes away the power from the school, destroys the phones, etc., etc., it just didn't make... It was one of those, like, because the plot demands it sort of things, and it just it just wasn't all that great.
Yeah, they were really inconsistent with how the zombies worked, where one of the characters points out a little bit in the middle of the film that most of the zombies' brains are gone, but the kids are shown to be pretty smart. They're more towards, like I said, 28 days later than Dawn of the Dead. They're able to open, like in one scene, they're not able to open doors, but in another one, they're able to figure out that they can turn the power off in the school and cut the phone lines.
Actually, that's one thing that against this movie is that there's a lot of plot convenience, where there's a lot of things that are done because the plot demands it. And I'm going to kind of venture into somewhat spoilers, but there's a scene when they're breaking out from the school, and Rainn Wilson, he like gives the keys to Elijah Wood so they can get out. You know, Rainn Wilson could have easily just like gotten out at that point, but they just kind of had him run in there or run back in that crowd of zombies just to have his like epic reveal at the end, and it was really stupid.
The one thing that stood out to me was the cinematography. And the best way that I can describe it is in a school project where everyone in the class is an amateur, except for that one guy who's had professional experience, and his work just stands out from the rest. And in this, it was the cinematography, because there were a lot of shots in the film that were very well done. There were a lot of points where there was actual suspense, like the movie got silent, you really didn't know what was going to happen next, and it was just this really well shot wrapping around a poorly scripted, really poorly acted movie.
Actually, that is one thing, is that like when you get to the second half of the movie, especially when the one kid he's a diabetic and they have to get like a candy bar for him, it actually does have like actually kind of good like scenes that are actually kind of suspenseful, despite everything else around it just being like not good in general.
It's almost like they took a foreign film and then dubbed it into English, and the translation was really poorly done, so it just comes off sounding terrible.
Speaking of things that sound really terrible, dual rear wheel.
Oh yeah, I think this movie has made me illiterate. It's obvious from the get-go that every character was given their own ad-lib joke to run through the movie. The guy that plays Doug chose the line of whenever he goes to make a speech, he quiets everyone down even after they've already stopped talking, and especially he singles out one character to be like, okay, I'm talking, be quiet. Elijah Wood was stopping multiple times through the movie to talk about his book that nobody cared about, which was a plot that went nowhere, which kind of points to the fact that they were ad-libbing it, because it clearly wasn't written into the script. Rainn Wilson's character has a problem saying dual rear wheel, and they start the joke in the beginning where it goes on for like 30 seconds, and he's talking, but the whole time it's just dead air, basically, of him going dual rear wheel, and he can't say it. And the joke is so good that they repeat it 3 times throughout the movie.
Actually, I think you had actually a really good point before we started this when you said that it must have been one of those things where it was probably his first take, and they just thought it was hilarious on set, and they inexplicably wanted to keep it in the movie, like, well after someone should have just said no. That's probably the only reason why that this, like, awful joke made its way 3 times, one of which was at the very end of the movie, and clearly dubbed over, no less.
My idea for it, I think it's probably on point. It's kind of a case of tunnel vision, where it was obvious that they probably found it funny on set. You know, it's like it became an in-joke with the production crew, and it made it into the final movie, and they never had a person to look in and say, that's not funny. But it's like, oh, you know, he probably screwed his line up once, and they thought it was hilarious, so it's like, oh, let's, you know, Rainn Wilson, I'll make that my running gag, and I'll ad-lib it in pointless areas of the film.
Although, actually, I on that topic, sort of, the one thing that I really do have to wonder is, why are Elijah Wood and Rainn Wilson in this movie? It's not like they're kind of wash-ups or they're way past their prime. Like, Elijah Wood, he has Wilfred. Rainn Wilson, he does a lot of, like, modest indie movies. Like, they didn't have to resort to a movie named Cooties that was, like, this incompetent and poorly written.
I want to say it was just one of those, we'll spend a month shooting it, and we'll have some fun, get a paycheck out of it. They're going for the Danny Trejo, Adam Sandler combo. Although, I don't know about that. I did come up with a joke that, I did come up with a plot device that would have been better if they had put it in the movie. It was one of my predictions that sorely turned out to be wrong. I wanted them to have a point where, in the beginning of the film, Elijah Wood gets scratched by the zombie kid. The kid that turns out to be the leader of the group. And they find out later in the film, or they deduce, that the zombie virus doesn't work if you hit puberty. And given the constant small jokes about Elijah Wood, I was kind of hoping for that scene where Elijah, when he's like, I have something to confess, I wanted it to be, I never went through puberty. Like, that he would have had some disorder that he never went through puberty, and that's like, oh, is Elijah Wood going to turn into a zombie? Because they pick up and drop that whole, I got cut, I'm getting sick, and then a half an hour later, oh, I'm better now.
Yeah. Well, actually, in all fairness, coming back to the whole I never went through puberty twist, in all fairness, like Elijah Wood, he looks pretty much the same from Fellowship of the Ring from when he did The Hobbit, which, bear in mind, that's at least easily a 10, close to 15-year, time gap. So, I don't know, I would have preferred seeing something like that in the movie.
Yeah. Speaking of which, they put in a reference to The Hobbit. Rainn Wilson calls Elijah Wood a hobbit, and then he calls him a squirrel. And I had to look this up, and there's an episode of a TV show, a cartoon where Elijah Wood plays the voice of a squirrel. And it seems too specific to not be a reference, but it is so obscure that you almost want to say that it's a mistake.
Yeah, no, it's kind of funny because they kind of went with the most obvious reference and rebuttal they could possibly find, and then they proceed with the squirrel one with being the weirdest, obscure, where no one in a million years would ever actually even guess that.
And this, speaking of script writing, this is an indie movie, so you have to have the pretentious social commentary preaching. You have the kids being hooked on Adderall and Ritalin. You have the kids being disrespectful. One of the first things that you see in the film is the kid saying goodbye to his mom, and the mom's like, oh, have a fun day at school. He goes, fuck you, Mom. She says, oh, well, fuck you too. And the kid in the classroom that ends up being the lead zombie is looking up vaginas on his phone in class, and he's like, my name is Patriot, because I was born on 9/11, and he's like, that's why when I grow up, I'm going to go join the Marines and become, kill those towel heads.
Yeah, no, that's actually something, it's more so very early on in the movie, they kind of sporadically have it throughout the rest, but very early on, it becomes really pandering and just really out of place. Actually, the weirdest one is, the very opening when it shows, that animal farm when it shows them basically kill the chicken and the process of it goes through becoming a chicken nugget. Yep. I felt like it was one of those weird super pro vegan documentaries you see on Netflix all the time. It kind of it started off with that and then just dropped that tone right after. Didn't even address it even one bit after that.
Naturally, they bring the pink slime into it.
Oh, actually, that's what I know that it falls under the it's just a movie category, but we were mentioning this the first time we watched it, where that chicken nugget, the one with all the brown with the goo in it, that would not have made it that far into the cafeteria. That thing would have barely made it off the conveyor belt, let alone have a kid actually bite into it.
Mm-hmm. So the only character really worth anything, and it's definitely not Allison Pill either. I made a note that she had a fleeting moment of personality. I want to say that her moment of ad-lib is the scene where she suddenly flips out and tells everyone that she hates them, and she's sick of putting up with all of the crap that she's had to that we never see in the movie.
Actually, that's the other one, is that she's like has the whole shitty, cruel world thing, where I kind of seemed like I was venturing off in another social commentary territory of sorts. But yeah, no, there's nothing before or after that scene that where she really acts like lashes out or is that bitter or resentful to any of them.
The only character I found interesting in the movie was Doug, the sociopathic character. He, like, all the other characters, whenever they talk, it's kind of dead air. They're very poorly scripted. He was the only character that kind of delivered his lines, where whenever he was describing something, it was, whenever he would kind of inadvertently make a joke, it was funny.
Actually, that's the other one, is not only did he actually have pretty good comedic timing, he was also the only one who actually seemed like he was actually figuring things out as it went along. Like, for instance, like, he figures out, like, the virus or why certain people get it, or even at the end of the movie, kind of has an idea for, like, a vaccine of sorts. Like, not that the movie could have or should have been just about him, but he's, like, the only one who was really holding things together throughout, like, the duration of the whole movie.
He was the only one that really made me laugh. Like, his observations brought a lot of the jokes together. Like, in the beginning, when they're attacked in the teacher's lounge by a zombie, and the zombie tackles this woman that previously wasn't even in the shots into the locker, and he comes up and goes, "Oh my god, who's that lady?" I laughed at his scenes. Every time he would make an observation, or he decides to rummage through the dead to figure out what's going on, and he comes out with, like, his hands covered in vomit and shit, and he's like, "Oh, don't worry, I got gloves on." I'm like, "No, you don't."
Actually, I think now it's time to transition to the exact opposite of Doug, and that is Jorge Garcia's character, who is probably the most dead air and, like, the most irrelevant part of the whole movie. Like, because the whole point is that he's a crossing guard of sorts, and so with that, he also does shrooms in a van, and he just stays in this van for, like, the rest of the movie for the most part. And his scenes are really terrible. It doesn't add anything. And I think he's going to be one of those guys where he just, like, appears in all these direct-to-Netflix movies, because we already had him in Ridiculous 6, we had him in this, and he's, like, probably usually the worst part of these movies as well.
His character basically exists to probably, one, get in the stoner market. Like, yeah, his whole thing is he does shrooms and he's tripping out during the entirety of the movie. But the other half of it is they also need a way to convey a story to the audience when the characters are all running through a school. So his job is to turn on a radio so that the audience can get fleeting glimpses of, hey, this zombie epidemic is, reaching into other towns. And that's the only job that he plays pretty much right up until the end, when he suddenly shows up to rescue them. And so the movie, it pretty much, it's basically Dawn of the Dead, but in a school rather than a house.
Actually, now that you brought up the end of the movie, I think one thing that needs to be addressed is that the trailer for this movie, in chronological order, spoils the whole movie. Like, it's up there with, like, the Superman 3 trailer, where it shows, like, even the very end scene, like, the end, like, the climax, even they show that, like, explicitly.
One thing I will say, though, is that they actually have a running joke that starts off in the beginning and the punchline is at the end, because he drives into school, he parks his car, and then he gets out and he notices that "Eat a cock" is written in the dust on the back of his car. It's drawn on by the kid that becomes the head zombie, and then at the end of the movie, when they're driving away, the zombie is on the car, slams on the brakes, throws him off, and then he turns the car, he starts backing up and he goes, "Eat a cock," and there's a chicken on the back of the car. Mm-hmm. And the kid literally bends down to, like, level his mouth.
I thought, at first I saw that, I thought it was something that, like, it was, like, fleeting thing, like, it was in my head, but when I watched it the second time, I was like, wow, they actually had this kid bend down so they could, like, have this shot where he conveniently gets caught and then gets pinned to the tree.
The good thing about the movie is that they realized how bad the script was. There's a point in the film where they have to get out of the school, and so they gear up. And Rainn Wilson says, this is the point in the film where the heroes gear up. This is that film. And he's giving a speech during the whole time that they're gearing up, and the music is just drowning it out. I couldn't hear half of what he was saying. The usual pep talk. So even the movie kind of figured you really had no interest in that point what the characters were saying, especially Rainn Wilson.
I kind of wish that they had something to drown out the dual rear wheel part. So I'm not sure how aware they could have been for the most part in that regard.
Oh no, they cut all the music out for that. It's just complete silence in all three parts where that joke goes. You have to center in on the joke. Otherwise the execution just isn't up to speed.
Yeah, I don't know. That's one of the things is that, like, I feel like I should be a little more critical on this movie, even though I've been slamming it quite a bit throughout this whole time, because there's really nothing worse than a bad comedy. Like, you can kind of laugh at, like, a bad sci-fi movie or a bad action movie, but it's really hard to laugh at a bad comedy or even kind of, like, try to support it, because just not good.
I almost don't want to call it a comedy. I mean, aside from a few jokes in the movie, they really didn't try for, like, there wasn't any real slapstick stuff. Aside from a couple of jokes here and there and the character of Doug being kind of quirky, they really didn't go for any comedy. Like, it was a zombie spoof, obviously, but they didn't go down the Wayans Brothers path of, inserting random zombie. It wasn't The Walking Deceased.
Yeah. Well,
it seemed more like Shaun of the Dead than The Walking Deceased.
Actually, that's one thing is I think I was thinking about this the first time I watched is that because I remember when we first reviewed The Walking Deceased, we were kind of thinking we should kind of like be a little more lenient on Tim Ogletree because that was his first movie. And he could probably do a little bit better, but
Fuck Tim Ogletree.
Yeah, fuck you, Tim Ogletree. But I digress. Fuck you, Tim Ogletree. You made me lose my train of thought.
The movie was produced by Spectre Vision, Glacial Films. The total running time is 88 minutes, and it had a gross...
Like
2 hours.
20 minutes
felt
right
like,
there.
It felt like 2.5 hours.
The good thing is the movie was profitable. The total gross was $55,749 US. I am not entirely sure what the budget is, but you can watch it online on Amazon Video for $3.99. Its popularity has gone down heavily. The director is Jonathan Millet and Carrie Murnion. It was written by Leigh Whannell, Ian Brennan, and more people. It's worth noting that Jonathan Millet and Carrie Murnion have directed absolutely nothing before that, and they're working on Bushwick, which is set to release in 2016.
Actually, I'm glad you brought that up because before I had the Tim Ogletree losing train of thought, that's why I wanted to bring up is that it's kind of impressive that like these two guys who haven't really done anything before actually had a movie that looked at least competently directed enough on a technical standpoint.
Did you know this is the second time that Elijah Wood plays a character who fights a monster in a school? The first time was in The Faculty, 1998. Goofs, yeah, they have a list of goofs. The power has been cut to the school, yet the vending machine still works.
Actually, yeah, I remember you brought that up the first time we watched. Like right away, you see the vending machine just kind of like in perfect place. Actually, it's the only thing well lit in the whole room.
The whole bit of them sneaking around the school, I thought, was, like I said, very well shot. And it was even better from the fact that none of the characters were talking.
Actually, the other thing is that I probably shouldn't have liked the scene as much as I did because there's like a lot of blatant like common sense things that could have like gotten them out of the situation. Like for instance, there's that part when he drops his flashlight in the vent, and there's that zombie girl where it's like they have enough time where they could easily like dodge out of sight, but they just kind of sit there because suspense.
Do you want to hear some factual mistakes that the IMDb community has found for this film?
Let's hear the factual mistakes.
A police car would have normally have a barrier between the front and the back seats. Therefore, the scene where the girl attacks the cop from the back seat is incorrect. She wouldn't be able to do this. Well, that also assumes that the film would have the ability to get an actual cop car. It reminds me of Pool Boy Drowning Out the Fury, where they had the cop car, but it doesn't move because they probably legally wouldn't have been able to have the vehicle in motion. So they just have a scene off to the side where the car's not even in the view, and they just dub in the sounds of the siren and the car pulling away. And the other one is, now tell me this person isn't somebody you'd want to watch a movie with. At 34 minutes and 4 seconds, the music room has a sign reading treble clef, misspelling the word clef.
I don't know, do people really give enough of a shit to go on Cooties, like, upon first viewing, and have to feel like they have to put down that specific of a detail?
Well, if you remember from The Ridiculous Six, somebody went on to IMDb to point out all of the factual errors with, well, you know, the ice cream cone hadn't been invented by the time that this movie came around, and neither was the hot dog or baseball.
I don't know, but even with that, I mean, that's pretty bad, but I can at least see people kind of being into, like, the historical inaccuracies of something. This is just, like, nitpicking about a damn sign in a music room.
I was trying to figure out where I recognized the vice principal from, and he was on Glee. That's disappointing.
Actually, because when I saw the vice principal, I thought it was, like, Steve Coogan, or at least some generic store brand version of the guy. And that's sort of something that, like, that's been, like, a running thing in all of the direct-to-Netflix movies, that there's always someone who kind of looks like an actor that's familiar, but then just something a little off about him or her. Like, for instance, when we did Dancer and His Dame, we kind of thought, like, we weren't sure if the main character was, like, some guy who was, like, Kevin James's brother or cousin or some relation to him.
There's a lot of discount dime store Kevin James lookalikes in the indie movie scene. A lot of really fat, awkward white guys. But you can't really talk about Elijah Wood and Allison Pill without going into the romance subplot that doesn't go anywhere, because throughout the film they set up Allison Pill and Rainn Wilson are getting, you know, they're a heavy couple and they have a big fight. Elijah Wood and Allison Pill obviously have a connection together, and then it just falls apart.
And it's not even like, because I remember when I got to the end where you kind of you might think that Rainn Wilson's character is dead. You kind of think that at least kind of settles the love triangle, but then he shows up at the end and then they just don't address it ever again.
He shows up at the end with Jorge Garcia, and I'd like to add in my own factual error, because they're in the van as they're driving away at the end, and they ask him, "Oh, how'd you know where to find us?" He goes, "I always know where to find my dual rear," and that's how they end the movie.
Yeah, put aside the god-awful line, like, that, it kind of just shows that, like, there's a lot of because the plot demands it sort of things, where it's like, oh, why can the zombies open up this door but not later on? Because the plot demands. Or, why is that kid, like, the one who can shut off the electricity? It's like, oh, because the plot demands it. Or, how does he know where to find his dual rear wheel? Because the plot demands it. I don't know, the writing is just, like, putting aside how bad the jokes are, it's just really lazy writing all around.
Jonathan Millett's next movie is Bushwick, coming out this year. In a Brooklyn neighborhood, 20-year-old Lucy and war veteran Stoop must cross a treacherous 5 blocks in order to escape an invading military force. That seems like quite a change from a guy who just had Elijah Wood killing elementary school students.
And actually, I guess on that topic, like, I mean, it sounds like it's pretty serious, but going by the IMDb page, it's at least, like, specifically an action movie, so that is a pretty far way to go for them.
The movie stars Dave Bautista, Brittany Snow, Arturo Castro, Angelique Zambrana, Jeremy Harris, and a bunch of other people.
I'm actually surprised they got Dave Bautista to be, like, in a starring role. I don't know, I'm guessing that this must be one of his, like, posts, like, Guardians of the Galaxy offers. You know, But in all fairness, I did think he was pretty good in Guardians of the Galaxy, so I'd give him the benefit of the doubt for this one. As for Brittany Snow, I thought she was, like, done with acting, like, years ago. Yeah, in case you didn't know, she was the girl, she was on, like, you know, American Dreams. She did a lot of, like, other small movies around that point. She was alright, but I didn't think that she was still in the business.
So, ultimately, would you recommend Cooties?
Not really. It's kind of a wishy-washy lean more towards a no. It's, we were kind of saying overall, like, it's an extremely poorly written movie that seems to have, like, a decent cinematographer, solid directing, and at least actors who seem like they are trying to salvage it. At least there's a couple that are, but I don't know, like, lazy writing and a bad comedy, no less. It's really hard to give, like, any recommendation on that.
Well, Al's walked out. So, I guess that kind of wraps it up. Until next week on Direct to Netflix, I'm Connor.
I'm Colin.
And I'm not Al. Good night, Danny Trejo.
Good night, Danny Trejo. And fuck you, Tim Ogletree.